The Synoptic Gospels present three different perspectives or versions of who Jesus was. Today we're so used to hear John and Matthew and Luke and Mark that we even confuse one gospel with the other, and we actually think and we put together this Jesus as it is presented by all the different gospels. What we do not understand is that at the very beginning, the community of St. Mark's did not have the version of St. Matthew. Plus, it was written many years later. And that the other community of St. Matthew probably never heard of St. Mark's. That did not mean that they were not Christians or Catholics. It means that their perspective of Christ was different. Why is that? Well, if you remember, the printing press was introduced in the world in the year 1450, around the discovery of the New World of the Americas. So for 1400 years, people were, and even more than that, obviously before Christ, people were writing and copying one after the other. They were copying by hand what was written. So to have a gospel, exclusive gospel in this community would have been totally impossible. So some communities, let's say in California, people in Los Angeles, they have the book of St. Mark's, and probably not even the whole book. While in New York, they probably would have had St. John. And maybe in Florida, people would have St. Matthew. So the people in Florida would not have known anything about what John wrote. This idea of a universal church, like what the Catholic Church means, universal, meant that every community was free to have different views of who Jesus was. And this sometimes creates problems today, because today we want one people believing in one thing, which was not necessarily the case. This has been brought together more from the 1500s to this time. In the last 500 years, we have seen a church more united. But before that, the church was not that united. In fact, in the very beginning, for the first 300 years, the church was not united at all. The church was running from one side to the other, from one community to another. And that church has to be, the word of God has to be spread by word of mouth, preaching, the number one. So the Gospels are not a historical event. They're not written to say, this is the biography of Christ. In fact, none of them will say that. They will say this is just to document some of the actions of Jesus. And in fact, Mark will say it is the Evangelium, the gospel. Actually, the word gospel means the good news. These books are to speak to people about the good news. Therefore, they are a preaching tool. They're not historical. That's the reason many times we find discrepancies in the history. So sometimes when the writers, the sacred writers, went to write, they made lots of mistakes. And these mistakes have to do with timing. When some people will say that Herod was alive, probably was not. When they said that Jesus was born in the time of Herod, either Herod had died 4 years before that, or Jesus was born 4 to 6 years before the sacred books say that he was born. So there's a lot of controversy about the accuracy and the historical facts in the Bible. That does not mean that the Bible is not the Word of God. It is inspired. But God did not come down and write it himself. In fact, many of the apostles that we hear, like Peter and St. John, they're believed to be illiterate. They did not know how to read and write. And in fact, in the books of Acts, you will find that the description of St. John was that he was illiterate. He could not write. So if Peter and the apostles could not read and write, the Virgin Mary did not know how to read and write. So if these people did not know how to read and write, they needed other people to write. When St. Mark writes, he does not write about his own experience. He never met Jesus. St. Mark was converted and he learned about Jesus from others. So when he's writing what other people said and probably what other people wrote. We believe that both St. Mark and Matthew, and actually St. Luke as well, they were reading another book that for whatever reason disappeared from history. And that Matthew and Luke had Mark in front of them when they were writing their own stories. And there's some instances in which what Matthew and Luke writes is exactly the same as Mark, as if they are just seeing it and writing it down. There are other occasions in which the books and the stories are different. And they create differences, and they also create some problems in the text. So, for example, in the Sermon of the Mountain, the Beatitudes, when we hear Jesus on the Sermon of the Mountains, one of them will say that he's in the mountain, when the other one will say it was actually not a mountain at all. This discrepancies for me doesn't mean much. For other people, especially for those who say there's no mistakes in the Bible, they create a lot of problems, because how will you justify that this person says something is black and the other one says it was actually yellow? We believe that the gospel is inspired by God. It has the revelation of God, but it was written by the disciples of disciples. Why are these writings so late? Like I said earlier, it's because they thought Jesus was coming right now. So they never thought of writing or documenting what Jesus did. It is through word of mouth that this information comes to us 35 to 65 years later. To make things worse, the writings that we have are a copy of a copy of a copy, and it dates to the year around 200s, the 2nd century, probably around 180. So if the books that we have are that late, the originals are gone from us, at least for now. Maybe archaeologically we can find in the future something, but right now we don't have the originals. They're all copies. The book of St. John, for example, that was written around the year 100, probably 65 years after Jesus' death. That book, the copy that we have, never said that St. John was the one who wrote it. It's not on the later copies, the copies that we get from the years 200s and 300s, that says this was written by the beloved disciple of Jesus. And that is believed to be added later on, because the earlier copies that we got archaeologically did not have that section. When we study the Bible, we want to understand the historical components, but also the beauty of the Bible. And in the Bible, I like to do something that is very special to me. I like to let Jesus speak to me in his wisdom. So regardless of whether Matthew or Mark was written in 65 or 35 years or at the time of Jesus, the writings of the Bible contain the beauty and the wisdom of Jesus. And it can be transmitted to us today as we read. And this wisdom is given to us through the Gospels. I always ask people to just sit down, take a deep breath, close the Bible, and meditate and ask the Lord to bring wisdom into their lives. So I open the Bible wherever it comes, and I put my finger in one section, and then I read what's in there, and I meditate on it. And as the Lord speaks to me, I try to focus on today's life, onto my life. What does it mean to me? What does it mean to you? So I invite you to open the Bible in the section of the Gospels and choose a page and read it and see what the Lord is telling you today.